resistance became very adept at laying mines, at setting traps, at setting explosives. They became excellent at it by any standards. There was one point where they were laying a tank, anti-tank mines underneath where there had been tank tracks before, and then once they dug it out, they carried away the dirt. They put the mine in its place, they put more dirt down, and then with a little pencils and sticks, they recreated the tank tracks over the top of the mine, so that the natural thing for the next tank that came along was to go in the tracks of the tank that had come before. So if they did that, they were in for a surprise.
The thing about combat is that if the enemy is watching and a vehicle approaches unaware, he is able to fix his sights with his grenade launcher. But if at that very moment I turn my guns on him, even if I don't shoot, don't you think the guy's heart is already in his throat? He sighted the target, but he didn't shoot. Didn't shoot what he targeted. You understand why I do that? I won't even shoot, just drive along and dramatically swing the guns around towards those areas, moving them back and forth.
With ground operations failing, the Soviets brought in their most effective weapon of the war, helicopter gunships. These almost turned the tide until the mid-80s, when the United States gave the resistance Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Stingers forced helicopters to keep their distance, returning the focus back to ground warfare. But the Soviets were determined to keep up the pressure on the mujahideen, particularly on the forces led by Ahmad Shah Massoud, also known as the Lion of Panjshir.
The Soviets sent 20,000 troops at a time up the Panjshir Valley. On 9 occasions, there were 9 major Panjshir offensives, all with tanks and with armor, all with air cover. Every single time they were defeated and pushed back by what may have been at that point 2,000 to 3,000 resistance fighters, mujahideen. It was a classic example of the wrong armor being used in the wrong environment.
You could win that war on one condition. If we were to send in huge military forces, and these forces would have neutralized all resistance, then you could win. But we couldn't do that. I'll tell you why. Because those so-called flying detachments are what we called the counter-revolutionary detachments. They spread themselves out among the people in the villages. And in order to liquidate such a detachment, you would have to blow up or bomb the village or destroy it with tanks. We couldn't do that, because that was the civilian population.
The fact is that the Soviets were very much part of the action when they would so-called supposedly liberate a village and tell that to widows and the millions of maimed people. Remember always that 1.5 million people were killed in the Afghan war, and it wasn't by the Afghan army. Most of those people were killed by the Soviets, and that just can't be forgotten.
Future weapons. Knowledge is power. What do you do when you're... For 5 years, the Soviet people were told the Red Army was sent to Afghanistan to build schools, and plant trees. But by 1986, the number of dead teenagers buried in unmarked graves was too great to hide. Morale had deteriorated to the point where folk songs were written about soldiers being carried home in body bags.
I've seen eyes on young faces, eyes that should belong to very old people. Those kids, what they saw in Afghanistan was, as I said, beyond normal human experience. And this was reflected in their eyes.
In 1986, the USSR's new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, decided to slowly withdraw Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The retreat had to be gradual, or it would be seen for what it really was, the first Soviet admission that a communist revolution had failed. And worse, the victors were the warriors of Islam. The Soviets had economic and strategic reasons for invading Afghanistan, but a central goal was far more sweeping. They wanted to stop the spread of what they considered Islamic extremism. In fact, the decision to invade seems to have been triggered by a 1979 riot in the city of Herat. The socialist government had launched a campaign to teach Afghan women how to read. This outraged religious conservatives. Rioters broke into a Soviet compound and beheaded dozens of Russians and their families. The Kremlin drafted its invasion plans soon after. The Soviets always claimed that the momentum of history was on their side. But history had made other plans.
When the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, they were determined not to repeat the image of America leaving Vietnam, that they were not going to leave Afghanistan, as they put it, on the struts of helicopters off the top of their embassy roof. So they mounted a very brutal, one might say, campaign to make it look as though they were leaving in a peaceful, orderly fashion.
Yes, this operation probably is the best that I remember still, because I've never seen so many dead bodies in my life, so much blood in my life. Soviet troops were standing along the road in the south of Selang Pass in the mountains, and they launched early in the morning, January 23rd, 1989, a heavy attack. Ahmad Shah Massoud, a mujahideen leader who supposedly was in that region, he pulled out and took all his forces out. So that attack was launched against peaceful villagers, men, women, children. They destroyed half of the mountains. They destroyed all the villages. They just killed all the people there. And basically it was called, you declare a victory and run.
We pulled out the Soviet troops not because they had suffered a defeat, but because the atmosphere that had developed throughout the world, we must sincerely acknowledge it was a legitimate development. And in that specific region, the atmosphere became such that we had to pull our troops out. And inside our own country, our young people were dying. It was a tragedy for these families.
The Soviet Union claimed that 15,000 of its soldiers were killed and another 35,000 wounded during 10 years of fighting the mujahideen. The true figure may never be determined. The soldiers who survived returned home to find the Soviet Empire falling apart. Further, the new freedom of the press revealed the brutality of the Afghan war to a mass audience. These war stories were much less black and white than the glorious tales of World War II.
Well, I think that, first of all, someone who never was in Afghanistan doesn't understand what